Good afternoon and welcome to our second out of 5 webinar sessions. I'm Laurent Lamblin and will be your host today. Today's session will focus on a serious conversion killer being onboarding. We all know how hard it is to convince an investor to finish his onboarding, especially in a digital context. The heavily regulated environment in which we operate seems to make it even harder. Investors and even advisors often see the onboarding and especially risk profiling as a tedious process, a legal must-do, the last administrative hurdle before investing. And yet, this process could be so much more. Today, our two speakers will inspire you how to streamline a boring legal must-do and turn it into a potent commercial weapon. Jurgen Vandenbroucke, our first speaker, will inspire you with some actionable behavioral insights, which help you not only to improve, but also to future-proof your current investor onboarding process. Jurgen has over 20 years of experience at various entities within the KBC Group. Formerly the head of innovation at KBC Asset Management, Jurgen is now the founder and managing director of everyoneINVESTED, the KBC Wealth Tech spin-off. Also, Jurgen regularly takes initiatives to contribute to a world where everyone is not only invested, but also better informed. Witness his 2 books on improving financial literacy. Jurgen holds a PhD in behavioral finance and has published numerous academic publications on the topic. He teaches financial engineering at the University of Antwerp and is also research associate at the renowned EDEC Risk Institute. After Jurgen's session, we will take some time for questions. Please do not hesitate to post your questions in the chat. And our next speaker, Dara O'Brien, will share with you how KBC Bank Ireland managed to boost the investor onboarding, both in digital and a more traditional context. He will also share with you the commercial impact of their upgraded process, both in terms of quality and performance. Dara is a senior sales specialist for KBC Asset Management Ireland and has over 15 years experience in retail banking, including as a qualified financial advisor, a lean practitioner specializing in implementing efficiencies within sales processes, and as a sales coach. Over the last 3 years, he has been actively involved in supporting the investment sales network at KBC Bank Ireland, whilst also helping to create and grow the digital distribution model. Dara has a keen interest in behavioral finance and graduated with an LLB from NUI Galway in 2004. After his session, we will also have some time for Q&A. Don't hesitate to post again your questions in the chat. Dara and Jurgen will be pleased to answer them. At some point, the speakers will invite you to participate in an anonymous poll. And of course, we will show you the result during the session. And if you already have the results of the first poll online, well, I see indeed that a lot of people put this business resolution high on their agenda, and I'm sure our speakers today will inspire you on how to give actually that resolution a real boost. So let me invite Jurgen Vandenbroucke to take over my screen now for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Jurgen.
So good afternoon, everybody. So indeed, I will try to inspire you with respect to the onboarding process when it comes to advisory in investments, mainly in a digitized way. But this visual starts by setting the scene and thinking about investor onboarding in the classical sense, sitting together with a client, a cup of coffee, and taking the time to fill in the classic questionnaire to find out the risk preferences of this new investment client. And in that context, the conversion rate tends to be very high. If the client really has taken the effort to come and visit you at a branch, if COVID rules allow, of course, and he sits down together with you to fill out the questionnaire, very likely you will complete that process. Things become, of course, very different if we cast the same setting in a digital context, where we assume that the client is going to take care of it himself, sitting in isolation with his digital device without any human encouragement. In that situation, onboarding often becomes less converting and to the client is perceived as a boring legal must do. Even though also in that digital context, of course, it sparks the beginning of a long-term client relationship. It's the greatest opportunity you have to get to know your client and so in such a way that you are able to advise them in a way that will stand the test of time. So that's the challenge we have. How can we, in a purely digitized context, improve the onboarding process of a client so that we as advisors or as financial institutions can better formulate investment advices that are personal and that are going to last over time? So that's the idea, the challenge that we have. And let's try to dissect it first and foremost in a number of steps that are always in one way or the other represented in this initial onboarding flow. Of course, MiFID requires to assess the financial wealth of your client. What's the financial situation, both in short-term financial income as well as more longer-term, more general assets? That's the kind of assessment you need to make. And of course, it's very important for you to know in order to formulate an investment advice that is realistic for this client. A second important step is to assess the risk reward preferences. How does your client look at risk and reward? There are clearly differences between people, and you want to know as clearly as possible what the identifying situation is for this particular client. Additionally, we have to, somewhere in the future legally obliged, also to assess the ESG preferences, which also impact the kind of advice that you're going to formulate for this client. There's necessarily also some knowledge and experience to be assessed to see whether certain proposals are fit and appropriate for this client. And then finally, we have target markets. Does this particular product that you want to propose, has it been designed to fit the client profile that is sitting in front of you? Now, of course, there might be other local requirements that need to be added as well, but this is the way we like to visualize it just to stress a few things. First thing that we stress with this visual is that at Everyone Invested, we like to look at this process in a modular way. We provide solutions for each of these components in such a way that it is easy for you to potentially slip in one of these modules into an existing process. So gradually improving to a better world. Second thing we like to stress with this visual is the fact that clearly in terms of content, they tend to differ. They tend to differ being very client specific to the left. The financial situation is the most specific you can have, as well as the preferences, of course, in terms of risk reward and ESG. But as you move more to the right, you have more product specific elements. And target market is the most explicit example of that because there you really want to see whether the product is suited for this client and has been designed for the kind of client that is sitting in front of you. So that's a bit the positioning of the onboarding process as we look at it and as we develop solutions to improve it. And today's focus is basically on these risk reward preferences, because there we think there's lots of room to improve, definitely in a digital world. And we will try to explain in full detail what we mean, but we will first mention, as always, our main inspiration, which is Professor Kahneman. You may know him as the Nobel laureate of 2002, but most of you, I'm sure, know him from his bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow. And that's the real anchor, the benchmark for the profiling and the risk assessment that we will propose to you today. It's basically a literal translation or implementation of the book's title being Thinking Fast and Slow. Now let's try to summarize very briefly this 600-page book in just a few slides. So the basic notion of the title is that there are actually two ways in which thoughts come to your mind, not only in finance, but also in real life. And that's the whole essence of the idea that we have two parts of our brains, or at least two ways of processing information and two ways of making decisions, which are crucially different and that also translate into the world of investments. Now, what are these two parts? The first part is what we call thinking fast. That's where the book's title starts from. It's a intuitive, an emotional, and an automatic way of thinking. One example could be if you burn your fingers, you immediately move away from the source of the heat. Don't think, oh, that comes a bit warm on my finger, let's keep it away because otherwise I get burned. That kind of reflection is not something we do in that kind of intuitive reaction. So that's the example of situations where we act upon instincts. A second way of processing information is the thinking slow, sitting down, considering all options, and then making a conscious decision. Well thought of, analytically analyzed, rational, and with some mental effort. An example could be, again, very artificial, of course, writing out or solving a Sudoku. That's not something you do based on the thinking fast, intuitive way. You have to sit down, reason, and fill out the riddle as it goes. So that's the two ways of, very briefly, how to think about thinking fast and thinking slow. And now let's try to transpose that and bring that into the world of investments and basically when assessing risk and reward preferences. Imagine that we have a situation where we are situated now, today, on the x-axis, and we have 1,000 euro to invest on the y-axis. How do we today present a client that kind of situation of what could be the future evolution of his 1,000 euro to assess the risk preferences of this client? Now, typically, not necessarily graphically, but typically what we try to assess is we make a few assumptions, simulations of what the future could bring, and we show the client what the possibilities are if he gets to this longer future point in time, showing basically a vertical reflection showing that there is an average, of course, and there is some dispersion. The average is where we think with our best information today where the return or the value of his portfolio will be, but there's clearly uncertainty as to will we be above or will we be below the average. And the extent that the actual return may differ from the expected return is then summarized in some risk metric, typically volatility. And the client should realize that if he needs or if he wants a higher average value, that he should take more unpredictability as a consequence. And that is then how we summarize in most profiling exercises going around today these so-called rational preferences. It's the classic risk profile of which we know also from established theory that people on average prefer more to less, but they dislike risk. Everybody wants to have as high as average as possible, but to some extent, an extra higher increase in the average is less preferred because the additional risk is no longer tolerated. And that's how many, or not all, financial institutions look at risk preferences and define risk profiles ranging from very defensive over defensive to very dynamic or some sorts of that kind. That's all very good. That's all very client centric, but there's more to it. There's more to it if you want to envisage a long-term client relationship, and there's definitely more to it if you again are thinking about this process in a purely digital context where there's no human encouragement or human guidance. And the other side is the thinking slow part. The thinking slow part of this same situation is that we will not jump from today into the remote future. We will evolve day by day from now until that future point in time. And then the question arises, how does your client live through this situation? Are there situations, financial markets going up and down, that make the client leave before he reaches the initial endpoint that you had in mind? So that's the thinking slow part that we no longer envisage here, but now we look at the thinking fast. How will the client react if he sits down to see the evening news, see that the markets have dropped by 5%? Will he stick to his investment or will he go to your digital device and push the sell button? So that's also very important information for you to know when onboarding the client. What does it take to keep the client on board and take him to this future point in time? And there, The insights from Kahneman and his followers show us that losses loom larger than gains. If you reach the end point in a way that along the way there were lots of losses to digest, well, then maybe your investment client has become a savings client for already many, many, many years. If, on the other hand, your client looks at it more from a purely rational point of view and has switched off his fast thinking capabilities, then he might sit through the market decreases, looking still at the longer term where he knows what goes down must go up. So those are two complementary views that are crucially important when onboarding your client. And again, specifically in a digital context, because this, what we have now on the screen, the fast thinking of the client is typically something, a kind of information that the advisor knows. He knows that this defensive or dynamic client is not just defensive or dynamic full stop. He knows that this client rings him up in the morning if markets went down, or another client might just discuss market fluctuations when coming by for the next 6 monthly portfolio report. So this kind of human nature, this kind of emotional behavior of the investor along the way is typically something that is the kind of human knowledge that your advisors have. But in a digital context, it's crucially important to capture that into your process in order to keep the client invested also afterwards as the going gets tough. So in our view at Everyone Invested, the risk reward preferences that we assess is a combination preferably of these two elements. Like any positioning system, so to speak, it takes two coordinates to position your clients in the world of investments. You need to know what it takes to keep the client on board, and only then can you look at the trade-off between average and risk in the longer term. And thanks to the means of digitization, we are able to do that in a more personalized way. So not hypothetical questions with a limited set of answers, but much more personal, much more interactive. Also, we use a different way of assessing the information in both cases, which keeps it mentally refreshing for the user and hence contributes to a higher conversion rate. And in both cases, we use a sound methodological underpinning to really conclude that we reveal the preferences of the client rather than implying them from our predefined questions. Now, this might all seem nice and perhaps a bit theoretical to you all. And you might also think from a regulatory or compliance point of view, well, let's be careful because we can't mix and start shake our existing advisory or risk profiling procedure. And of course, that's the why we always stressed in the beginning that we look at this in a modular kind of way. The modulation allows you to mix the rational preferences and the behavioral preferences, the thinking fast and the thinking slow, or to keep them separate and also map them separately, perhaps starting with the one that your current process is lacking. But be informed that what we have told you, what we have shown you, this two-dimensional way of looking at risk preferences is very much the view that is growing attention in our business. On this slide, you see two external references that make exactly the same point as I have explained in the previous slides. The one to the left is originating from the CFA Institute, where many of you maybe earned their CFA certificate. So they're really breeding the colleagues for the future. So this kind of knowledge is dripping in already as we speak, and to the best, of course, to the benefit of the clients. And to the right, of course, also a very important source is the European regulator, who in the summer of 2017 published a consultation paper where one of the headings was literally called Assess the Suitability in the Light of Behavioral Finance Findings, where they also encouraged the business to refine the current profiling and look beyond what we have called today the thinking slow process. Another illustration is the fact that indeed also regulators recognize that this kind of evolution is to be encouraged. In the development phase and in preparation for the launch of our solutions, we have consulted with the multiple of regulators across Europe, the AFM, the Dutch regulator, the FSMA, the Belgian regulator, and most recently the CBI, the Central Bank of Ireland, all very much encouraging what we have shown them and approving the process as we have implemented it in the meantime also in KBC Ireland, where Dara will share his experience and his KPIs with us. So in all these cases, we were confirmed and confirmed that the methodological underpinning of how we assess the risk preferences is very much encouraged and approved. We use behavioral finance findings crucially, and that is, of course, the element that is appealed by, for example, this ESMA consultation paper. And something that we cherish very dearly is also the fact that the regulators acknowledge that a better and a refined profiling of customers in the onboarding process ultimately contributes to consumer protection. Put differently, it encourages long-term investorship, which of course, bottom line also contributes to a more stable and a more sustainable profit on investments. So in a nutshell, with this visual, let's try to summarize it in one slogan: turning a legal must-do into a commercial weapon, as Laurent called it, or into a commercial opportunity. Could also be stated as being turning compliance, which is of course a legal must-do by essence, but turn it also and enrich it to something that is performing to the benefit of your clients and your investment business. So that concludes my story. I see that indeed the poll is showing up. It says that, do you already have digital investment flows? Yes, execution only. Yes, advisory. Or yes, both execution only and advisory. Or at current, you may lack digital investment flows. So while awaiting questions from some of the participants, I'm very curious to see what the results of the poll will be.
I have a first question here coming in. There is no questionnaire to assess risks. You also say that was refreshing mentally. Question is, can you elaborate how it is done actually?
Well, the way we assess the preferences of the client is by presenting him choices to be made, choices where the options are limited to make it easier, and also choices that are framed in the context of the client, meaning that we use the information that the client has revealed in the previous steps of the process in order to present choices that in his personal situation are realistic. For example, if you have a dilemma or a choice to be made expressed in euro terms, then we use amounts that for this particular client in the context of his financial wealth are realistic. So nowhere in our process do you encounter the classical approach of asking a question like, how do you feel, or how will you feel, even worse, in the future if markets go down? Because we all know that it might tick the box of a question that is legally compliant, but it's very poorly predictive of the actual future behavior of the client. So we do it in a different way. Actually, we collaborated for that with some of the known academics in the field in order to have a process that reveals the preferences of the client in that respect by presenting him options to choose A and B in such a way that it has a fast conversion, meaning that with a limited number of choices, we are able to detect what for this particular client the behavioral preferences are or his loss aversion is. And the same for the risk preferences. There we take a very visual, slightly gamified approach, simply to avoid to push a questionnaire on a smartphone, because we know that does not convert.
And now I see indeed that a lot of people are already having digital investment flows. Most of them even have both, just trailed by execution only flows and advisory flows. Still a third of the attendees do not have digital flows, so that's really something that we can also work on. I see also another question coming in. Two questions coming in, actually. I will take some time here, or do we take them after the second speaker? Maybe a first one here is that the person was wondering how you can properly assess the thinking fast behavioral preferences. He would think that the client will only exhibit those in an actual crisis situation, which is hard to simulate in an onboarding flow. I would guess that by presenting scenarios, you only trigger the slow part of the brain. It's not real money, just hypothetical.
Yes, that's the case. I mean, for the behavioral preferences, for the thinking fast process, we do not present scenarios indeed. There we do it in a way that is actually put a bit different and in a different context than the pure investment context, exactly to have a mentally refreshing part of the journey to assess literally how the client balances gains and losses in a general context, which we then use to map it in his behavioral preferences for a risk profiling point of view. So short answer, we do not indeed use lines or graphs like I did today for the explanation. That's not the kind of visualization we use in our process. It's based on a more methodological underpinning, which is more sound.
Okay. I had a last question coming in, but I think Dara will actually reply on that one during his presentation. Is whether customers are mature enough for such type of interaction? But to answer that, I leave the floor to Dara, who will guide us and share his experience he had while implementing those kind of solutions at KBC Bank Ireland.
Great. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining, and hopefully you found some interest in what Jurgen was explaining. Just to give you a little bit of information on KBC Ireland. KBC Ireland have been pushing the digital envelope in the banking space for quite a while, and are firmly in the digital first area when it comes to banking in Ireland. As you can see on the next slide, we have introduced a number of different options, from our award-winning onboarding for current accounts through to a more recent development, which is again, just you'll see on the next slide, our thumb-powered pensions, which were also another award-winning digital mobile enhancement to the sales journey. With that in mind, I suppose it became very natural that the next focus for the online and digital journey was the investment space. Really, we have a major aim in the investment space, which is encapsulated on the next slide, which is quite a simple goal on one level, and it's simply to help everybody to become an investor, and then at the same time to help them stay invested. It sounds like a very simple goal, but just because the goal itself is simple doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into something that's easy to achieve. And when we started devising and having a look at how we would design this digital investment journey and how we can expand into this space to reach this goal, it became quite evident that there were three main areas that were going to present some problems. And we really needed to find a workable and innovative solution to these three problems. So if I maybe just highlight the three different areas that we needed to concern ourselves with, and maybe explain a little bit about how the new profiler especially helped us overcome some of these problems, you'll see. So the first problem that we came with was really having a look and making sure that we don't carry our own preconceptions into the digital space. It's very, very easy to do, I think, without automatically realizing it. We come from an as-is journey, and the first thing we can often think about when it comes to digitizing what we've got available is that we simply take the existing journey and automate it. And that really loses a lot of the impact and a lot of the innovation that the digitization can bring with it. So it's important that we don't take our own preconceptions with us, and that we have a look at redesigning the new journey for the new space within which we're operating. So to have a look and see exactly what we ask and why we ask it, and can we ask that a different way, and can we indeed present it in a way which means we don't necessarily have to ask absolutely everything along the way. So that was the first thing we had to bear in mind. The second issue, which is a huge issue, I think, that is really, really overlooked. And it comes down to our own behavioral preconceptions. So the kind of biases that we have naturally as human beings, and the blocks that they can present when it comes to looking at something like an investment journey in general for a customer. So we're here pretty much at the start of January. It's quite a good time, I think, for people to think about New Year's resolutions. I'm sure quite a few of you listening have made some kind of resolution. Generally speaking, when you look at what the most common New Year's resolutions people have, they tend to be things like, I want to improve my savings or my financial well-being. I want to maybe do a little bit more with my money or do a little bit better. Some people say, maybe I want to get fit. I want to go to the gym. I want to start running. I want to start exercising. For other people, it might be, I want to improve my diet. I want to lose weight. So we get all these resolutions based around things that we should do that will have a good impact for us into the future. You never really come across people who've made a New Year's resolution to maybe drink some more beer or drink some more wine or to eat some chocolate or to eat more fast food, for example. We tend not to have to really challenge ourselves to do those things that we find pleasurable in the instant. And this kind of concept was summed up by a very well-known thinker in this space of kind of behavioral finance, behavioral economics, called Richard Thaler. And really what he said was, as humans, we are very much wired towards taking immediate enjoyment now and not thinking about the long-term consequences. We find it very, very hard to think in the long term. So for example, it's much easier for us to eat the donut now and not think about the long-term health consequence than it is to actually do the hard work of going to the gym now to enjoy a long-term consequence of maybe being fit. And when you look at the investment space, it becomes really apparent why customers can have problems on the investment journey, even at the best of times. So for example, when you think about what an investment involves, it involves somebody taking away something that could give them immediate enjoyment, as in a pile of cash that they could spend on a holiday in the morning, and putting it away for a long-term benefit, which in the area of investment can sometimes be a little bit intangible or certainly uncertain, depending on the type of investment over the period of time. And because we have these biases against doing that, even when we sit down face to face with an advisor who maybe we get on very well personally with, it becomes an awful lot more difficult when we expect a customer to do this as part of a digital onboarding journey that they may be doing from their own couch with their mobile phone. And for that reason, it makes it even more important that we look at things that traditionally we viewed as blocks or tedious issues in the process that we need to do. And we need to turn them from being something tedious that involves work or boredom from the client into something that becomes engaging for the client and that becomes part of an enjoyable experience. It's only when we get to that stage that we begin to kind of win this war against the behavioral element. So for us, it was really, really important that we found some solutions that allow us to do this. And with the new profiler that we adopted, it allowed us to move into this space. How? Well, simply if we look at the third issue, it kind of gives me a platform to explain. So rather than just taking your typical traditional one for all or one fits all questionnaire and asking this series of static questions, what we actually were able to do was turn the profiler itself into this kind of hyper-realized and gamified experience for customers. So the profiler itself replaces a lot of traditional text-heavy questions, which come with their own kind of order biases a lot of the time as well, and replace them with a series of intuitive screens where customers simply click or swipe or scroll or drop down in order to give the information that we need from the profiler to present them in a step or two further on with a gamified experience. So this little game that they go through, where each question that they're presented is based specifically on their own financial situation. And for the customer, it stops being a series of questions and I suppose invasive lists of text responses, and it becomes more of a journey related to the customer, exploring how the customer might feel at certain times during their investment journey, how they might react, and then being able to present them with a more personalized synopsis of them as an investor on a financial basis, but also on a more emotive basis as well. And for us, that was a real game changer. So it was more about removing the way that we presented the information that we required and making it much more compelling for the customer to want to provide that to us. And the profiler really allowed us to move into that space and to use the digital platform as a tool in itself, as opposed to just a way to elicit responses from a customer. I suppose, what benefits did we see from it? Well, if we move to the next slide, we'll be able to see that some of the immediate benefits became clear on a commercial basis. So the sales conversion with the new profiler increased by 6%, which was a really solid response for us, and a real kind of proving point that we had done the right thing, that we were engaging the customer better. The acceptance rate, so the instances by which the customer accepted straight off the calculated risk profile they were presented with and didn't choose to opt down to a different profile, increased 5-fold with the new profiler in place, which again was a huge multiplier for us. And then finally, we also noticed something that we weren't really expecting at the start, but it was a change in the calculated profiles. So the customer profiles that were calculated from the new profiler began to move, and the very defensive and defensive profiles reduced down to a level of about 20% at present, and the more dynamic and very dynamic profiles increased. And in fact, the dynamic outcomes moved to about 60%. And this was something that customers explained to us occurred because they thought longer and they thought differently about the issue of temporary losses, about the fact that investment portfolios may go down for short periods of time. They thought a little bit more about their horizon, and they thought about a little bit more about their reaction in these times. And because we presented them with more probing questions, and because we presented them with some more interesting concepts, they thought a little bit harder about what type of investor they were. And again, anybody working in the investment space will probably realize that if you have more customers of a dynamic predisposition, they tend to be the customers that stay invested for a little bit longer, and they tend to be the customers that have better outcomes over the longer period of time. So in terms of a longer term relationship, this second goal we have of helping customers to remain invested for a longer period of time, this was something that was really kind of important to us. And I'll just leave you on the final slide there of my presentation with some of the verbatims from the clients who undertook the profiler themselves, and also some of the advisors who use this profiler also in a face-to-face scenario with customers. And again, the recurring themes on this seem to be a lot more interest from the customer, a lot more thinking from the customer, rather than just you know, instinctually picking option A, option B, option C from a drop-down list. And that's it from the KBC side. We're really excited, I suppose, to move to the next phase of this, to make a couple of amendments and changes to improve the profiler journey as well. For us, this is the start of an ongoing journey.
Okay, thank you very much, Dara, for sharing your expertise with that. I see also the polls coming up now. General one, are you convinced that digital risk profiling can be more than a legal must-do? Yes, always believed it. Yes, more than ever after today's presentation. Or just no, I still think it is just a legal must-do that we have to get quickly around to actually start doing real business. I leave the poll on for a second. I will see if there are already questions coming in. Did the regulators have any questions around the gamification element? It's obviously a beneficial tool for various reasons, considering customer behavioral theories, but would be interested in how a regulator, being typically somewhat traditional in terms of financial services oversight and consumer protection, would receive this approach. Maybe that's something that Dara can elaborate on. Dara, you understood the question?
Yes, I did indeed. There were
Okay.
no specific questions on the actual format of the gamification element itself. I suppose what came across was that we had moved to address an issue that ESMA had particularly highlighted in relation to its own guidelines on MiFID. And this was something that I think is becoming increasingly important for the industry, in that there's a specific recommendation that providers of investment services need to look beyond just the financial elements of their investors and the cold hard finances side, and towards the behavioral element and the emotional aspects of investing. So not just this financial ability to bear loss, but also this emotional ability to bear loss of investors. And this for Ireland was a first. That we were being the first provider of investments to address specifically this emotional element. From that point of view, there was nothing really to benchmark against. There was an intuitive approach, and the regulators were very happy overall that we had moved towards bridging this gap. Is there room for improvement? Will the way that this is presented in future change? We don't know, but at the moment, it makes sense to our customers. They enjoy it. It makes sense to the regulator, and it brings us one step closer to what ESMA really wants from an overall regulatory journey.
Okay. Okay, then here I see that we are slightly starting to run over time. I would like to conclude our, first of all, maybe looking at a pause here. We see that, of course, the majority already believed that we could do more with the typical journey of onboarding. We have obviously already shifted a bit, some people that think that it can be of more significance to them. And of course, we hope by next section to also convince some reluctant people who think that it's still a hurdle in doing business. So that concludes today's session. Recording will be made available later to all the attendees. Please, when leaving, give us some feedback, give us your feedback. This will certainly help us improve our future sessions. Our next session in February will tackle the commoditization of investment solutions and services. And if you want to attend, please do not forget to register through the Zoom links made available on LinkedIn. Once again, thanks for joining. Thanks to our speakers, Jurgen and Dara, and looking forward to see you on February 23rd. Thank you very much and have a nice day.